We're all in this together. You're watching Social Distance Learning by ISBA. Get the kids together. Learn something new. Ask a few questions and engage.
Good evening. My name is Judy Shafford. I just want to welcome you to the program this evening. I am a retired career civil servant and a lay leader in the Jewish community. I do not have formal clergy training, but among Jews, we encourage everyone to be educated. And to that end, this evening, we're all going to become, I hope, a little more educated. I want to welcome your questions. You can put them in the comments section below. And that is so fitting because we're going to be talking about Passover this evening. And the holiday of Passover, we're going to be working a little bit out of time because ordinarily Passover occurs in the spring and we start talking about it in February, March, beginning of April. But we're going to celebrate Passover perhaps in Arizona in hopes that it might be a little bit cooler than it actually is today. So we'll be a little bit out of time, but you're going to have a chance to have all your questions answered to the best that I can. And let's get started on the program. So I've entitled this the second creation or the new creation because there are some interesting parallels that I've noticed between the creation story that we see in Genesis. We call it Bereshit, in the beginning, when God began to create heaven and earth. And this is from the Hebrew Bible. The earth being unformed and void, we say in Hebrew, tohu vavohu, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. So the stage is set, and the big dramatic moment comes. Vayomer Elohim yehi or vayehi or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So the initial act of creation in the Hebrew Bible, and this is shared by the Christian Bible, is that God speaks, and by speaking brings into being the existence of light, which is a precursor to other life. Next, please. Okay, and a little later in the same first chapter, God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, that's us, and God said to them, be fertile and increase. We say in Hebrew, pru urvu, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. So it's very important here that God separated the light from the darkness to create day and night in the second day, separates the sea from the land. We skipped over this part. God creates animals and plant life and creates human beings and elevates human beings over the plants and the animals and gives the human beings a special responsibility. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply is the first commandment that we find in all of the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses. Next. Well, we'll skip a little bit now towards a few generations. I think it's 20. And this is Joseph. And Joseph was the grandson of the first monotheist, who was Abraham. And Abraham is the forefather that the 3 Abrahamic religions share. So Abraham is the father of Ishmael, who is the father of Islam, and the father of Isaac, from whom the Hebrews, then the Israelites, and later the Jews descend. And then the Christians come out of Judaism later on with the advent of Jesus. So Abraham's grandson, Jacob, had 12 sons. The second to the youngest is Joseph, who was kind of an obnoxious kid, and his brothers couldn't stand him, and he was a tattletale and just a basic irritation. So they decided to sell him off into slavery, and they sell him to some traveling merchants who take him down to Egypt. This is important because the Israelite people, and I'll call them interchangeably the Israelites and the Jews, but the Israelite people came to be from these 12 brothers who became the 12 tribes of Israel. When Joseph was sold into slavery, he went to Egypt and he strangely became a great success. How did he become a success? By being thrown into jail. And you may say, well, how is that a success? In jail, he met a couple of people who had odd dreams. They were servants to the Pharaoh, who was the emperor of Egypt. And the Pharaoh's servants told their dreams to the various inmates there. No one could figure them out. But Joseph said, God will give me the strength to do this. And he told the dreams. They both came true. And a couple of years later, Pharaoh had some very puzzling dreams. Pharaoh's dreams consisted of, this is a famous story in the Bible, 7 fat cows were at the Nile, and 7 skinny, sickly cows came out of the Nile, ate the 7 fat cows, but didn't become fat themselves. And there were sheaves of grain. Fat sheaves, 7 fat sheaves were consumed by 7 skinny, nasty-looking sheaves, and they remained terrible looking. Nobody knew what this was about. We know all about it because we've read the Bible or other stories about it. But Pharaoh was puzzled, and Joseph, his baker said, or his cupbearer said, "Oh, Pharaoh, there was this guy in jail who was really good at telling dreams, and you should bring him here, and maybe he can tell you what the dream means." P.S. Joseph interprets the dream and says there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh, for no explicable management reason, puts Joseph in charge of the entire kingdom except for Pharaoh himself. He elevates Joseph to power, grants him all kinds of responsibilities, and Joseph manages the affairs of Egypt, collecting all the grain during the fat years and redistributing it during the years of famine. It was a great arrangement, and Joseph brought all of his brothers down to Egypt. This is where the story of Passover really begins. And at the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Torah, there was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. We don't know if that means that he didn't actually know Joseph as a historical figure, or that he was not interested in knowing about Joseph. But there's a very interesting devolution that begins at this point. The Pharaoh feels very threatened by the Israelite people, who in the intervening generations from Joseph and his brothers until this Pharaoh grew greatly in their population. And the author of the Torah, whether it's divine or inspired by a human being inspired by a divine source, says that the Israelites were becoming very fertile and they were reproducing. So that same the same words in Hebrew, the same roots in Hebrew of be fruitful and multiply are repeated in Exodus, that they were fruitful, they filled the land, and they multiplied and filled the land. So the Pharaoh found that a terrible, terrible threat, and made efforts to control the reproduction of the Israelite people. First, he summoned a couple of midwives and said, go to the birthing stool of the Israelite women. If it's a boy baby, kill the baby, and if it's a girl baby, let it live. And the midwives would have no part of it. They decided that they told the Pharaoh when he summoned them again, and he said, what's going on here? How come these babies are not getting killed? And the midwives said, the Israelite women are so fast, they deliver their babies before the midwives have a chance to arrive. So we can't do anything about that. Then there was a commandment by the Pharaoh to kill all the male babies, to drown them in the Nile. This sets the stage for the birth of Moses. Moses is the major protagonist in the rest of the Torah. He's considered in Judaism our greatest teacher. We call him Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi or teacher. So the things that happen in the meanwhile, before Moses gets onto the scene, is that the Israelite people become enslaved. The Pharaoh puts great burdens on them, and they make their bricks, and they complain, and the Pharaoh says, if you're going to complain, I'm taking away the straw. So it made their jobs harder and harder, and it was a very difficult time. They were slaves. So they were deprived of the means of production. They were downtrodden. Things were terrible. Moses, meanwhile, was born. His mother hid him for 3 months, couldn't hide him anymore, daubed a basket with tar and set him afloat on the river so that the daughter of Pharaoh would find him when she was out bathing in the Nile. The mother dispatched the sister Miriam to watch the basket and make sure that it connected with the Pharaoh's daughter. So the Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby, discovers he's a little boy, figures out that he's a Hebrew, and then says, gee, I wonder who will nurse this baby. And the sister says, I know someone who probably wants to nurse him right now. So Moses was kept in his mother's home until he was weaned, brought to the palace, and raised as a prince of Egypt. Why is this important? He didn't have the headset of slavery. He had the entitlement of being a prince, and he did not have a mindset of being someone who was oppressed. So when Moses was 40 years old, he was out walking. He sees an Israelite who he knows is his blood kin, beaten by a taskmaster. Okay, I'm going to interrupt myself while we're going here because we have questions. During Passover, Azra asks, families share a meal called Seder. What does the word Seder mean? Seder means order, and the Passover meal is a funny one because your parents may have told you don't read at the table, but every time we have a Seder, there's a very specific order in which we do things, one of which is retelling the tale of how the Passover comes about. But we have something called a Haggadah, and a Haggadah is lahagid, is to tell. So we're commanded to tell the story of Passover during the Seder meal. And one of the highlights of this the Seder at Passover is the youngest child will recite something called the four questions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's what Seder means. I think Moses had just seen someone being beaten by a taskmaster. Well, he killed that somebody. He killed the taskmaster, excuse me. And he thought he'd get away with it. But the next day he was out walking about, and an Israelite slave said, I saw you kill that guy. So Moses fled to Midian, where he became the son-in-law of the high priest, and he married and he started having kids. But meanwhile, there was terrible enslavement, and the people cried out. So remember, we talked about the creation at the beginning, and we had the devolution of the killing of the babies. The people cried out, and the Eternal heard the cries of the people. So that at that point in the Torah, Moses is a shepherd. He has no worries. He's not thinking about anybody but his family out in Midian. And he stumbles upon some strange sight in the desert. Okay, the question is, just to be clear, Moses knew he was a Hebrew while being raised in Pharaoh's home. The Torah is silent on that question, but the understanding that we get from that, at least at the point where he felt there was an injustice of the taskmaster beating a man, we infer from that he knew that he was a Hebrew, and that is our tradition, that he knew who he was. But he had the dual identity, as so many of us do in a culture where we're a minority. Okay, so Moses is watching the sheep, and he sees this very odd situation where there was a little bush, nothing gigantic, just a small, humble bush, and it appeared to be on fire, but the fire did not consume the bush at all. And Moses came closer because he thought, that's very, very odd. And as soon as he got nearby, the voice of God came out of the bush, told him to take his sandals off and to listen. At that point, Moses was called to prophecy. He became a prophet and a teacher at that point. He said, I am not up to this. I don't know enough. I'm not a good speaker. I don't know what you want from me, God. And God said, you and your brother Aaron are going to go to the Pharaoh and tell him to let your people go. And Moses was very much cowed by this, but he followed God's word. He went back to Egypt, and they start the process of negotiating getting out of Egypt. So let me see what my next slide is. Yes. And for those of you who have seen the Ten Commandments, there's our friend Charlton Heston on the right. And on the left, you see Moses, whose name means drawn from the water, Moshe. It's from an Egyptian word. It wasn't originally a Hebrew name, although obviously now it is. So our friend Moses goes to the Pharaoh, who requires some persuasion. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. So it took 10 plagues. That each time there's a back and forth. Moses said, let my people go. We want to go into the desert to worship our God. Pharaoh says, okay, a couple of you can go, but not the women and the children, and none of your flocks and none of your possessions. So the negotiation escalates. So I want to talk about this again as a decreation or a destruction. So what water is life-giving, and the first plague turns the Nile to blood. And the second plague, there's swarms of frogs that come out of the Nile. And then there are lice and flies, and then it attacks the cattle. So in the same way that we had the first people, we call them Adam and Eve, they were to have dominion over the cattle and the other animals and the swarming creatures. This is besides being an attack on many of the Egyptian deities, like the bull, it's also a deconstruction of the creation. Boils, this is an attack on the humans. Hail and fire, this is starting to break down the difference between a contained fire and some kind of weird inferno where there's fire and hail at the same time. Locusts, it destroys agriculture. And then we get to the 9th and 10th plagues. And if you remember in the beginning, the creation of the world began when God said, Vayehi or, let there be light. Now they said that this darkness, which was the 9th plague, was so thick that a person could not see the person next to him. It's not even like a moonless night. It's even darker. And it's also been taken to be a metaphorical darkness, where after 8 earlier plagues, the Egyptians and even Pharaoh were starting to feel a terrible depression, like this was never going to end. So it's a reversal of let there be light. It's God imposing darkness on people, where you don't have a separation of day and night. You no longer have those distinctions that were characteristic of the first few days of creation. And then finally, the final blow was that there was going to be a visitation by the angel of death. And the Israelites were told to prepare by making a sacrifice to God of a goat or a sheep, a young lamb or a kid, and taking the blood from that animal, sopping it up with a hyssop brush, and brushing the lintels and doorposts of their homes, so that the angel of death would know to pass over the doorpost, which is where we get the word Passover for the holiday. And that night, the firstborn of everything, the firstborn males of humans, of cattle, of sheep, all perished. They were all killed according to the Torah by the angel of death. For those who are more scientifically minded and don't mind interpreting scripture, the angel of death may have had some vigilante assistance, but you don't have to believe what I'm saying. I'm certainly not going to sell you on either theory. The Torah says it was the angel of death. Let's go to the next slide. Well, the Israelites did a bit of looting and gathered up all their possessions. And after they had eaten their sacrifice that night, they left the next day with all of their flocks, all of their children, all of their everything, and went to the edge of the Reed Sea. It gets called the Red Sea in the scripture, but the Red Sea is in a different area, so we know it to be the Reed Sea. The Israelites were terrified and said, what are we going to do now? The Pharaoh's chariots are behind us. What do we do? And Moses lifted up his staff, and the Israelites moved into the water, at which point it parted. Now, I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that this was the birth of the Israelites as a nation, and they were descending in through the birth canal of those parted waters into the land that would bring them towards the promised land, the land of Canaan. Next slide, please. So why was there a liberation from Egypt? In our tradition, the notion of being freed from slavery was not just to be free, because freedom was not, it wasn't meant to be kind of like people who live out in the desert and get off the grid. The point of the liberation was to be taken out of Egypt to serve God. And every Friday night, when Jews bless their wine before the Sabbath meal, we say that it's in remembrance of the 6 days of creation and the being brought out of the land of Egypt. That's a weekly ritual. In fact, it's something that we're meant to remember every day. The Torah is so concerned about this that it reminds us frequently that we need to do the right thing and to treat the stranger kindly, because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt, because we were slaves. It is incumbent on us to remember to treat the stranger kindly and to make sure that the widow and the orphan are taken care of. Okay. Okay. So the law is what we were given. That was the great gift. Can we have the next slide, please? So how are we supposed to remember this? We were commanded in the Torah to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We call that matzah in Hebrew. For on this very day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. In the first month, meaning the month of Nisan, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. So this is in Exodus a commandment to the Jewish people to observe Passover by eating matzah, which is, truth be told, the first few bites are delicious, but it's basically a tasteless cracker with no salt in it. It's amusing. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing that we're supposed to do during the time of the temple is we were supposed to slaughter a Passover sacrifice. And this again reiterates, you shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter, you shall eat unleavened bread, bread of distress. We call it alachma anya, the bread of affliction. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you may remember the day of your departure. The legend is that they didn't have time to let the bread rise, so it became matzah baked quickly and stowed, and everyone ran. It's the original fast food and the original takeout. Next, please. Okay, we're going to skip a lot of time. We're going to skip past King David and King Solomon. Solomon built the Holy Temple. There was that's where the sacrificial cult took place, because we prayed and we asked for forgiveness and atonement by the Holy Temple, which you can see on the right-hand side. In the back is a flame, and the Romans were sacking Jerusalem there. It was a major existential crisis for the Jewish people, because we had to figure out what the heck to do when we could no longer sacrifice to God in our holy temple in Jerusalem. Next. Oh, question. How long have Jewish people conducted Passover Seders with a Haggadah? Well, it is this is the Talmud here that is going to tell us to observe the Passover sacrifice, the Passover rituals, and to have a Seder. But in terms of Haggadot, uh, and having a Seder with a book, I think it's from handwritten manuscripts. That was early on. It's at least 2,500 years. It's probably from the Babylonian exile, but I don't quote me on that. It's at least after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the rabbis tried to figure out what was this religion going to be when we could no longer sacrifice. So this is one of the discussions. Rabban Gamliel, he was one of the great sages of that early period, used to say, whoever does not make mention of these three things on Pesach, meaning Passover, does not fulfill his duty. And these are they: Pesach, the Pesach, matzah, and bitter herbs. Pesach is the sacrifice, matzah and bitter herbs. The Pesach, because the omnipresent, meaning God, passed over the houses of our fathers in Egypt. The matzah, because our fathers were redeemed from Egypt. The bitter herb, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our fathers in Egypt. In every generation, a man is obligated to regard himself as though he personally had gone from Egypt, because it is said, and you shall tell your son on that day. So that's a quote from the Torah. And we take this very literally. We act as if we ourselves were slaves and we ourselves were liberated from slavery, even though we know, if you're sitting here in the desert southwest of the United States, we did literally, but we have to regard ourselves as if we had each come forth from Egypt ourselves. Next, please. Okay, so here is a plate that is part of the Seder ritual that we have on every Seder table, and it's called the Seder plate, very simply. And you can see, going clockwise from 12 o'clock, that there is a little bit of lettuce, and there's a shank bone to remind us of the Passover sacrifice. There is a mixture of nuts and apples and cinnamon and wine, although there are many different recipes. That's called charoset, and that is to remind us of the mortar that they used for the bricks in building the cities in Egypt. Then if you go to 6 o'clock, you can see that's some bitter herbs. That's usually horseradish. Then, because it's a spring holiday, at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock there, that's some parsley, a spring herb. And then finally, we have an egg to symbolize the circularity of spring and the seasons. And often it's roasted to symbolize the destruction of the temple. Next. I pulled out a bunch of books from my shelves. These are all examples of either leaders' guides or Passover Haggadot. So you can see in the lower left, there's a graphic novel kind of presentation, like a comic book of the story. There's a brand new Haggadah on the lower right by a modern translator. There's the one that I showed you earlier in the upper left. There's a children's one. There's a women's Seder one. There's a one by a famous artist. Basically, ever since the printing press, there has been a wild proliferation of different books for guiding us through the Seder meal, which is the most observed Jewish holiday of the year. And it's usually, as I said, celebrated in late March or sometime in April. Do all Jewish people eat the same foods, or is the food specialized to different regions? There's definitely differences. There are differences among the symbolic foods are the same. That we hold them up. Everyone eats matzah, everyone will eat bitter herbs. Different people define them differently. Some people think that romaine lettuce is a bitter herb. Some people might eat a radicchio. In my parents' and grandparents' tradition, horseradish is it'll bring you to God. It's a very powerful thing to eat, and we traditionally make it in we eat it plain, and then we put it in a sandwich between two pieces of matzah with some sweet charoset and some bitter horseradish, and it makes your eyes tear because we're supposed to remember the sadness of being enslaved. Next slide, please. This is an illustration. In fact, a couple of people are on this call or are in this photo right here. That's an illustration of we're reading. We've got the books in front of us. You can see that there's wine. We drink 4 glasses of wine, and we try to have a lively conversation about leaving Egypt and being freed to become the servants of God. Next. I think we're very close to the end here, right? Are there any other questions? Because otherwise I have a fun video I'd love to show you. Great. Thank you, everyone. Here's something that's just a little fun. Oh, wait a minute. Is there an appropriate greeting we can share with our Jewish friends during Passover? You can say Chag Sameach, which is happy holiday, or happy Passover, or that's probably the best one to use. This video that I'm going to show you is from an a cappella singing group called the Maccabees, and there's one of the songs that we sing at the Seder is called Dayenu, and it's a litany of things that if you had it's sung to God, and if we say, if you'd taken us out of Egypt, that would have been enough, Dayenu. If you had given us the Sabbath, that would have been enough, Dayenu. But the point is, it's a song of thanksgiving and joy, and this one is a little bit silly. I hope you enjoy it.
Ilu ilu hotzianu mi Mitzrayim hotzianu mi Mitzrayim dayenu 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 Ilu ilu koralanu etayam dayenu 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 Ilu ilu echilanu etaman dayenu 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 hey 2 3 4 Ilu ilu natan lanu et hashabat natan lanu dayenu dayenu Natan lanu et Torah dayenu 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 Oli Eretz Yisrael, 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 Dayenu. Die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. Die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. Die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, Dayenu. Die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, Dayenu.
Aviva, Aviva, it's time to open the door for Eliyahu.
And
Just a little levity. We like to have fun and to joke around. So I understand there are more questions. Is Passover one day or multiple days? That's a great question. Passover is in the Torah, the Passover is a 7-day holiday, and in the land of Israel, it is celebrated 7 days, the first night of which is the Seder meal. And Jewish holidays begin in the evening, so that's the very beginning of Passover is the Seder meal. In the diaspora, which is where we live, we celebrate traditionally for 8 days, although the Reform movement celebrates for 7 days. Can you explain the thing with the kids falling asleep at the table? Yes, the Passover meal usually doesn't begin until the Seder doesn't begin until 6 or even later in the evening. And by the time you're done with all the discussion and the singing and all of the rituals, you usually don't get to eat until well into the evening. It may be 9 or 10 or even midnight if you're very enthusiastic about the conversations. So every effort is made to engage the children and to involve them, because you're supposed to be, the whole point of the Seder is to teach your children and to let them know that they were part of leaving Egypt. But a lot of times kids get tired. Does the date vary because of the lunar calendar or another reason? The date does vary the date is always the same in the Hebrew calendar, but it varies in the Gregorian calendar because we go by lunar months and the months get out of sync. And then every so often, unlike Islam, we have leap years and we add another whole month, which sets it back in time, and then we don't have, it basically stays in the spring. I can't see that. As a shout out to, I can't read that whole question.
As a shout out to vegetarians, we replace the shank bone with roasted sweet potato or the sacrificial yam.
Yes, for those who do not eat meat, shank bone is might be offensive. I got one many years ago. I just keep it in my freezer, so I don't have to kill any more lambs to have a shank. What is the meaning of Dayenu? It's stuck in my head. Oh, Dayenu means it would have been enough. Die means enough, and Anu means to us. It would have been enough for us. And yes, it is an earworm, and we find that at my Seder, after 3 or 4 verses of that, and people repeat the chorus, and especially when the singing is bad, it sticks in your head forever. So you are way ahead of yourself there. You're all ready, Rumi. Any other questions? Well, everyone, it's been a delight for me to be here with you. It's very odd to teach a class without any faces that I get to see, but I could feel your presence, and I want to thank you for joining ISBA for this session.